G'day, welcome to this episode of the ADF Architecture TV channel. My name's Chris Muir, I'm an ADF Product Manager for Oracle Corporation. In today's episode, we're going to continue on from the previous episode where we wanted to talk about the concepts of bounded task load, data control scope options, and the transaction options. But in the previous episode, before talking about these options, I wanted to recap the concepts of a transaction and also that it is the data control that actually introduces these facilities into an ADF application. Now you might remember from that previous episode, though, we found that the data control hit some challenges when attempting to build an ADF web application. And there were some questions that we asked that were, if transactions are logically mapped to navigating groups of web pages, how do we map the data control transaction to these boundaries? And if an application uses multiple different data control types and instances, how do we commit and roll back those data control instances as a group? And if we need to support separate transactions per session, how do we configure this with just one data control? And finally, if ADF libraries may split data control definitions across separate libraries, how do we combine the data controls at runtime so they can share state? And what we're going to discover, it is the data control scope and transaction options of the bounded task flow that solves these challenges for the data control. In today's episode, we're going to look at the data control scope option in more detail, and in the following episode, we will talk about the transaction options. As you can see from this slide, the two options are available from the bounded task flow behavior tab. They're also available in the property inspector as well, and you can modify them in the relating bounded task flow XML file. And specifically looking at the data control scope option, it is the checkbox you can see located here, which of course has two states. Now ticked, it means you're sharing the data control scope, and unticked, well, it doesn't actually show you on the checkbox, at least in 11G, though in 12C we will make this more implicit because there will actually be a pop list here, and that pop list will show you that the opposite value, the unticked value for this checkbox, is isolated. That's also reflected in the XML file behind the scenes. Okay, so we know where the options are located, but what does shared and isolated data control scopes mean? Okay, the shared data control scope essentially means that between two task flows, one calling the other, that any data control instance will be shared. Okay, so shared ultimately means between the calling and the called task flow that if the data controls are of the same type and name, so say an ADF business component data control that is used in the two bounded task flows that are calling each other, essentially only one instance of that data control will be created and shared for both bounded task flows to use. Ultimately, this means that the view objects of the underlying ADF BC data control will not only be shared, there will only be one of them in memory, they will have the same current row indicators, you'll be editing the same records, and ultimately using one database connection under the covers to connect to the database, because ultimately, again, there's only one data control instance shared across the two bounded task flows. Now conversely, the isolated option for the data control scope option means obviously don't share data controls with the calling task flow. So to be a little bit more specific, what the isolated option means is when you have one task flow calling another task flow, even though at design time they might be using the same data controls that you've defined, essentially one data control, essentially what will happen is that when the first task flow makes use of the data control, it will create its own instance of the data control as expected. But when the second task flow is called from the first task flow, once it hits this isolated data control scope option, it will not reuse the same data control instance that was instantiated for the previous bounded task flow, but rather it will create another instance of it. So for the same user session, you end up with two instances of the data control from the one design time data control definition. So the issue that you hit then, well, this isn't an issue, I should say this is the functionality you get, is that if it was, say, an ADF business components data control, you'll end up with ultimately two root application module instances for the current user session, and underneath those, even though at design time there is one or many view objects defined, with one of those view objects, if they're accessed from both application modules and both bounded task flows, you essentially end up with two instances of those as well. So in terms of the view objects, between the two bounded task flows. You will not have any record coordination in terms of the current row. You will have isolated record editing, so a change in one of the view objects under one of the data control instances will not be reflected in the view object of the other data control instance unless it's requeried once the original one is committed. And also, because you're using two data control instances and only two application module instances, you're also using two connections. Okay, and that's an important point to make, because suddenly you start to realize that, hey, maybe this isolated data control scope option is very powerful and allows you to have multiple transactions per user, but the implementation of this under the cover is that each data control instance does take out its own connection with the database, and that has a resource hit on your database as a result. So as we now understand, this isolated data control scope option is an option that allows you for one user session to spawn multiple transactions, to isolate the data controls from each other and allow the user to do different things. Whereas the shared data control scope is completely the opposite. It's the idea that, hey, no, we want to share this state, we want to share these connections, we don't want to multiply the footprint of the user. And there's pros and cons of both approaches. Well, pros and cons is kind of the wrong word here, because they're just meeting different requirements. One is sharing state and allowing to build multiple bounded task flows calling each other, which will ultimately have one large transaction, where the other option is allowing you to create separate transactions based around individual bounded task flows or groups of bounded task flows, where at least one isolated data control scope is set at the beginning of a group of bounded task flows. So it's a very useful and important feature, and we can see that it fixes or addresses one of the challenges we talked about early on that data controls have. So let's try and explain this in a real example. In an application, imagine we have one ADF BC data control. In this example, you can see it's called App Module Data Control. And it has one view object called Departments View 1 that's obviously querying departments data back from the Oracle or whichever database you have in the background. Now, it just so happens we have an unbounded task flow. And the unbounded task flow is showing the data from that Departments View 1 object. And in this example, you can see not only will we seeing all the records, but in addition, the user has selected ID 80 sales. Let's just call that record 80. Now, from the unbounded task flow, we're then going to call a shared data control scoped bounded task flow. And in doing so, when we invoke it, that shared data control scope bounded task flow, well, it also happens to show the same view object. Now, because we're using a shared data control scope, when that second bounded task flow is called, a new instance of the data control is not created for the current session. It is shared. The existing data control scope, I should say the existing data control from the original unbounded task flow, that is effectively reused by the second bounded task flow. Because it is reused, that means the same instance of the view object is reused for the current session, and when we navigate to that second bounded task flow, which just happens to show the same data from the view objects, we can see that the 80 record, 80 sales, is already selected. And that's because the current row indicator for that view object, Departments View, it is the one and the same from the unbounded task flow. To extend this example, if we're then in that second bounded task flow, if the user was then to click on record 30, so 30 purchasing, now when we return to the unbounded task flow, again, because we're still sharing the same data control instance and this same underlying Departments View 1 object, we'll see that that current row indicator change is also reflected back in the original unbounded task flow that's showing the same Departments View object data. Let's take then an example of an isolated data control scope and play. So very much the same application here, the same ADF BC app module data control and Departments View object. And we can see that is actually displayed on the unbounded task flow page, and the user has again picked record 80 sales. Now, when we navigate to the second bounded task flow, in this example, we're using an isolated data control scope. When we navigate to that second bounded task flow, in this example, rather than showing all the data, we're just going to edit the current record. And the current record here isn't 80 sales, it's actually 10 administration. Now, why has that occurred? When this isolated data control scope bounded task flow has been called, because of the isolation option, essentially the original data control instance that was used by the unbounded task flow is, well, not reused by the additional bounded task flow. Instead, a second instance of the data control is created for the user or the session, and in turn a second instance of the department's view object is created for that new instance of the data control. Now, because that department's view object hasn't had its current row indicator changed yet, it's still at the initial record, that's why we see 10 administration in this example. Now let's work backwards. If the bounded task flow then is showing record 10 and administration with capital A and lowercase the rest of the word, administration I guess is the word here, and the user comes along and then changes that to uppercase, I wonder what's going to happen if the user then commits the record. If the user commits the record and then goes back to the original unbounded task flow, we might expect indeed that the 10 administration record would have been changed. But no, remember that the original unbounded task flow has its own instance of the data control, which is separate to that of the bounded task flow, and in addition has its own instance of the department's view object, which is separate to that of the bounded task flow. So A, it doesn't have its current row indicator updated to record 10, because essentially the two view objects in play under the two different data control instances. And B, even though the current row indicator has changed, we don't even see the data change to number 10, administration. We don't see the word administration go to uppercase, because while we have committed that second bounded task flow, we haven't asked the original bounded, or I should say task flow in this case, to re-query its data. So it still has a cached copy of the original 10 administration record in the middle tier for that current user, and unless we re-query it, we won't actually see that change that was made to the underlying data from the second bounded task flow. So hopefully with this shared data control scope and this isolated data control scope options, you can really see for the one user session how we can quite change the behavior of the bounded task flows when they call each other. So hopefully now you have a bit of an understanding of what the shared and isolated data control scope options do for bounded task flows and how they influence the runtime behavior of data controls. Now, it's good for programmers to know that, but it's also important for designers, architects and team leads to know about that option, because when you're designing your ADF architecture and you're designing how your application works, when you have a requirement that says, for example, that bounded task flows should share state, have an ongoing transaction, or you have a requirement that says one user session should support multiple transactions, you now know what the isolated and shared data control scope options can do to influence that behavior. So that concludes the discussions on the data control scope for the bounded task flows. In the next ADF Architecture TV channel episode, we're going to start talking about the transaction options. Now the data control scope option and the transaction options are related, but up to now we've been keeping the discussion fairly simplistic because it's easier to talk about the data control scope options to start out with. Without a doubt, when we look at the transaction options, they are somewhat more complex, and there's a little bit of a question of what do they actually provide, but in that episode I'll make you aware of what the exact goals of that particular set of options are. Most of the times you won't need to bother to configure them, but there is bonuses in actually making use of the transaction options within the bounded task flows. So thanks very much for joining us in this ADF Architecture TV episode, and hopefully we'll see you watching the next episode very soon.